모두 자리에 착석하셨으면 오늘의 북콘서트를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 지금부터 서울대학교 중앙도서관과 자유전공학부가 함께하는 2019년 제11회 북콘서트를 시작하겠습니다. 오늘 금요일 오후 이렇게 시간을 내어 북콘서트에 참석해 주신 학내외 선생님 여러분, 대학원생, 학부생, 방문객 여러분께 깊이 감사드립니다. 특히 독일문화원의 동아시아 관장이신 마라 스투켄베르크 관장님, 또 독일 대사관의 학술 담당이신 알렉산더 레너 참사관님, 독일 사가이자 여성 사가이시며 또 전 여가부 장관이셨던 정현백 장관님, 독일 사학회 회장 송충기 교수님, 또 이번 행사의 한국 측 주관자인 문수현 한양대 교수님 등을 비롯해서 서울 각지에서 멀리 관악까지 여기까지 와서 참석해 주신 여러분께 감사드립니다. 또 특히 이런 행사를 치는 데 있어서 여러 도움을 준 도서관과 자유전공학부의 행정 선생님들과 포스터전 도선트들에게도 고마움을 전하고 싶습니다. 오늘 잠시 순서를 먼저 안내드리고 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 먼저 저희 중앙도서관의 관장님이신 김영환 교수님께서 인사말과 축사를 해주신 다음에 제가 간단하게 프레벳 선생님을 소개하고 그다음에 프레벳 선생님께서 감정과 역사라는 제목의 북콘서트를 해주겠습니다. 그 후에 질의응답이 있겠습니다. 순서는 한글로 진행되고 강연은 영어로 이루어지지만 자막을 번역으로 제공했고 또 여러분께서 번역문을 갖고 계신 줄로 압니다. 강연 후에 질의응답은 통역을 하겠습니다. 그러면 먼저 서울대학교 중앙도서관 김영환 관장님께서 북콘서트 인사말을 주시겠습니다. 박수로 맞아주시기 바랍니다.
네, 여러분 반갑습니다. 오늘 강연자인 우테 프레베트 선생님에 대해서는 사회자인 조준희 선생님이 소개를 해주실 것으로 들었기 때문에 저는 그냥 간단하게 인사말만 드리겠습니다. 도서관은 올해부터 이 도서관 안에서 열리는 학술 행사나 문화 행사를 반드시 학내 여러 기관들하고 연계해서 공동 주최하거나 공동 주관하는 그런 방향을 택했습니다. 그래서 지난번에 다양성위원회와 함께 북콘서트를 연 적도 있고 또 기초교육원과 함께 연 적도 있습니다. 앞으로도 이런 방향을 계속함으로써 오늘처럼 이렇게 자리를 꽉 채우는 그런 좋은 행사가 되도록 노력할 것입니다. 여러 선생님도 학생 여러분도 많이 도와주시면 감사하겠습니다. 오늘 강연 외에도 여러분들 아시듯이 관정마루에서 아래층의 관정마루에서 감정의 힘 독일 1919라는 전시를 하고 있는데 이건 오늘의 강연자인 우테 프레베트 소장님이 직접 기획한 전시고 11월 한 달 동안 진행이 되는데 전시장에서 아침 10시부터 오후 5시까지 전시 내용에 대해 설명해주는 학생 도슨트 프로그램이 있습니다. 그래서 학생들이 항상 한 2명 정도 나와 있어서 외국인 학생들을 위해서는 영어와 중국어 등 외국어로도 해줄 수 있다고 합니다. 그래서 3355 또는 미리 신청을 하셔도 좋겠고 이 독일 현대사 100년을 여러분들이 잘 공부하는 그런 기회가 되었으면 어떨까 이렇게 생각을 합니다. 저에게는 독일이라는 나라는 무엇보다도 분데스리가의 나라입니다. 프란츠 베켄바우어와 로타 마테우스의 나라인데 그러나 또한 동시에 두 나라 다 분단국이었죠. 근데 큰 차이가 있습니다. 독일의 분단은 사실은 나치의 전쟁 범죄에 대한 처벌의 성격이 있었던 데 비해서 우리 한반도의 분단은 식민지 지배로 희생당한 희생자들이 또다시 희생을 당하는 그런 영어로 표현하자면 victimization of the victims, 희생자를 또 희생시키는 2차 가해 같은 그런 분단이었습니다. 그런데 독일의 분단은 지금 해결이 물론 완전히 해결된 건 아니지만 통일이 되었는 데 비해서 우리는 아직도 굉장히 큰 어려움에 처해 있어서 이럴 때일수록 독일의 경험이 우리한테 여러 가지 의미를 지닐 수 있지 않을까 그런 생각을 하고 있습니다. 사실 제가 문학을 전공하는 사람이니만큼 오늘 감정에 대해서 이야기를 하는 때라서 뭔가 한 가지 인사말에서 얘기는 더 하고 가고 싶었습니다. 그래서 제가 좋아하는 그 베르톨트 브레이트의 시 중에서 한 시를 잠깐 읽어볼까 싶습니다. 이게 아마 독일 현대사의 어떤 감정 중에서도 중요한 게 아닐까 싶은데, 사회주의자였던 베르톨트 브레이트가 동독의 자리를 잡은 후에 1953년 6월 17일 일어난 인민봉기를 보고 지은 시입니다. 우리말로 한번 읽고 영어 번역을 제가 읽겠습니다. 독일어로도 읽어볼까 싶었는데 제 독일어 발음이 너무 시원치 않아서 그건 좀 자제하는 게 낫겠습니다. 그 해결책이라는 짧은 시인데요. 6월 17일 인민봉기가 일어난 뒤 작가연맹 서기장은 스탈린가에서 전단을 나누어 주도록 했다. 그 전단에는 인민들이 어리석게도 정부의 신뢰를 잃어버렸으니 이것은 오직 2배의 노동을 통해서만 되찾을 수 있다고 쓰여져 있었다. 그렇다면 차라리 정부가 인민을 해산해버리고 다른 인민을 선출하는 것이 더욱 간단하지 않을까? 사회주의자인 브레이트가 사회주의 동독에서 인민봉기를 접하고 느꼈던 감정이 참 복잡했던 것 같습니다. 영어로 읽어보겠습니다. 제목이 영어로는 The Solution이라고 되어 있는데요. After the uprising of the 16th of June, the Secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed on the Stalin Alley, stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could only win it back by increased work quotas. Would it not in that case be simpler for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? 네, 고맙습니다.
관장님 인사 말씀 감사드립니다. 이어서 간단하게 그 프레벳 소장님을 소개하겠습니다. 오늘 강연 하러 와주신 우테 프레벳 선생님은 현재 독일 베를린 막스 프랑크 인간개발 분야 연구소 소장이시자 감정의 센터장으로서 현대 독일사와 여성사의 권위자이십니다. 특히 우리가 감정의 역사의 선구자로서 그 사실 분야를 그 여신 선생님이시기도 합니다. 프레벳 소장님께서는 그 빌레베트 대학에서 독일 현대사로 박사를 받으시고 베를린 자유대학 콘스탄트 대학에서 가르치다가 2003년 도미하셔서 미국 예일 대학에서 현대 유럽사를 가르치시다가 2008년부터 막스 플랑크 연구소 소장으로 부임해 계십니다. 프레벳 선생님께서는 사실 책을 너무 많이 쓰셨는데 그 중에 몇 개만 이제 소개하자면, 특히 선생님의 첫 책, 그 Women in German History는 사실 지금도 독일 그 현대 여성사에서 계속 읽히는 2만 세를 거듭한 책으로 이 책입니다. 저희 뭐 현대사 수업 들을 때도 읽던 책이고요. 그리고 또 이제 선생님께서 그 막스 플랑크 연구소에 부임하신 다음에 감정의 센터 소장을 겸임하면서 그 Emotions in History, 역사 속의 감정에 대해서 또 책을 쓰셨고, 그와 관련돼서 뭐 최근에는 도덕경제에 대한 책도 쓰셨고, 가장 최근에는 이제 그 모욕의 정치에 대한 책을 통해서 특히 감정의 역사가 오늘날 우리에게 시사하는 바를 또 다 들어내는 책을 쓰셨습니다. 그래서 이렇게 그 베를린 장벽이 무너진 지 30년을 하루 앞둔 오늘 이렇게 여기 서울까지 프레벳 선생님께서 오셔서 저희를 위해서 그 독일 현대사를 감정의 역사로 조망하는 강연을 준비해 주셔서 너무 감사드립니다. 그러면은 박수로 저희 프레벳 선생님을 맞이해 주시면 감사하겠습니다. Professor Frevert, it's a privilege to have you here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here today and giving me the honor of listening to me today, and also probably and hopefully watching the exhibition that is being so generously staged here and showed and displayed at Seoul National University Central Library. Now, I would like to start with a big thank you to all of the institutions. They disappeared now, but you might have seen them in the former slide, the 4 institutions that actually, 1, 2, 3, 4, that sponsored this event, starting with the Goethe Institute, the Seoul National University Library, the College of Liberal Arts, and some other institution. And of course, behind all these institutions, there are people. And I don't thank the institutions, but I thank people who are also here today. And they have made it possible for me to bring me here and to host me here, and have given me a wonderful time up to now, and I'm sure it will continue just like that. And I want to say a special thank you, of course, to Professor Kim, who just delivered a speech that I was unable to follow because it was in Korean, but I did understand a few names like Frau Stuckelberg, Franz Beckenbauer, and Hegel. And that makes a wonderful triad, actually. And the next person to thank is Professor Cho, who went out of his way of hosting that the exhibition and making everything else possible here at Seoul National University. And my final and probably most grateful thanks go to Professor Moon Soo Rang, my former PhD student from the University of Bielefeld, who also did a great job in translating my talk today. But I have a very, very strong request to all of you. Please don't look into the translation just now. Please try to look up to watch what's going on here on the screen. You will find a kind of, what is it, teleprompter, the subtitles that actually are what you might also read. Please look up. You hear my English words, you find the Korean translation underneath, and try to keep eye contact, because otherwise it's bad for the speaker when I look into eyes that I can't see. So thank you very much for that. Before I give you some insights into the background and the contents and the idea behind the exhibition that is being presented in the entrance hall to this university, I would like to give you some more information about this new approach to history, and to actually the idea which stands behind it of linking emotions and history. That's a pretty big topic, and it's also a very new topic. When I left Yale University in 2008 to found the Center for the History of Emotions at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development in Berlin, it should be first slide, yeah. Many colleagues actually wondered if Mrs. Frevert was doing it right. They didn't wonder about me changing places from New Haven, which is a pretty rough little town, city in the American East Coast, and exchanging that place with Berlin, which has a different reputation, let's put it this way. So that didn't come as a surprise, but which did come as a surprise to them is why she would now be focusing on the history of emotions, because in their view, emotions were neither suitable objects of historical analysis, nor did they really have any influence on history anyways. So, who cares? Emotions seem to be so subjective that they are at the most interesting for literary scholars. And some colleagues said I would actually be better off switching disciplines. History, at any rate, doesn't have time for emotions. But I wasn't headed off to work at a history department at a German university, which I had done before moving to the US. I was going to work at a Max Planck Institute. And Max Planck Institutes, like this one, are known for being innovative. They don't just follow what others are doing, but probe new paths to knowledge. The biggest group at my Institute for Human Development in Berlin are psychologists. And we have 4 departments, which you will see down there. And because emotions are part of a psychologist's job description, I thought, certainly my choice of topic would fit right in. boy, was I wrong, because they too were skeptical. For psychologists, emotions are emotions. They feel the same no matter who feels them, when, where, and why. People have always had emotions, I was told, and above all, the so-called 6 basic emotions identified by the emotion king of psychology, Paul Ekman. Here are his famous 6 American faces. Americans, I found out by now, are very easy to recognize the emotional states that are depicted on these faces, but I might try on Korean, a Korean audience, or mainly Korean audience here. So what do you think? Let's start from above, the blonde woman. What do you think she feels, or she expresses that she feels? What's your guess? Volunteers. Americans are faster, actually, to reply. Anger? Anger? Everybody agrees? Anger. Let's keep it in mind. The gentleman right next to her? Fear? Fear or surprise? Sure. And then the woman next to the gentleman? Disgust? And the woman on the bottom, to the bottom? Sorrow? The guy next to her? Joy, pleasure, and what was that? Surprise. So we have 2 choices of surprises. Maybe we can now blend in. So you're pretty good. Maybe because Korean society is already very Americanized. But I've had very different turnouts, actually, and that's important to remember. Ekman observed that around the world, people showed the same facial expressions when they felt happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. And later he distinguished between disgust and contempt and made 7 out of 6 basic emotions. Just as well, and despite substantial cultural differences, they recognized the emotions signified by the facial expressions of others. Can we have the next slide, please? Yes, thank you. So Ekman concluded, if the expression was the same and was perceived as being the same, then how the emotion felt must also be the same. And Charles Darwin, that he originally set out to refute, had a very similar notion back in the 1870s. But does this hypothesis check out? Even psychologists doubt it. They have methodological concerns about how Ekman collected his data, and they point to big discrepancies, which you can see here, in people's ability to recognize the feelings behind particular facial expressions. So 92% recognized happiness, but only 64% recognized fear, and 68% surprise. Developmental psychologists say happiness or pleasure is one of the first emotions that a human child feels. And they say the same about its opposite, the pain or diffuse unhappiness, expressed by, we all know that, crying and whining. All other emotions are much more complex. People have to learn how to feel and express them, which means that emotions are dependent on how people being socialized. In short, they are culturally contingent. Now, enter scholars of culture and historians. They make 3 points. First, every culture perceives and evaluates feelings in different ways, situates them in different contexts, and gives them different meanings. Some cultures discourage fear, while others have a hard time dealing with sadness. Obviously not Korean society, I learned. Some see hate as a positive, others as a negative. Love is, at least in Western culture, the emotion that is discussed the most. Think of how many bookshelves you could fill with books about love. Then think about all the advice literature even just the stuff printed since the turn of the millennium, about true love and its deceptive sibling infatuation. Now, compare them with past generations' ideas about love, and you will see how much today's understanding of love differs from that of the 17th or the 18th or the 19th century. So emotions do have a history, because love is, just like every other emotion, determined by culture. Culture stamps it in its own particular way and prescribes how to practice it, and who is to practice it and who is not. Cultures and societies change slowly but surely, and with them their style of framing emotions changes too. But, second point, how do cultures frame emotions? The linchpin is language, not just spoken or written language, but also body language, visual, figurative, and mimetic language. Emotions are closely bound to embodiment. They move our bodies, they move our faces, our skin, our limbs. They alter our pulse and our body temperature. Emotion comes from the Latin e movere, to stir up. Thus, it's important to make body language part of our definition and analysis of emotions. Let's take love again. Philosopher and mathematician Blaise Pascal, writing in the 17th century in France, said, "One falls in love by speaking a lot about love." His contemporary François de la Rochefoucauld mentioned that some people would never fall in love if they had never heard others talking about it. Maybe he meant it sarcastically, like those people are just following a convention and have never experienced the real, the authentic emotion. But you could also read it from a constructivist perspective, like sociologist Niklas Luhmann did. The code of love, as shaped by countless letters, poems, pictures, songs, and novels, the code of love is what empowers people to develop the emotion of love. What I'm trying to say is this: people live and love according to models, according to patterns articulated in language and other signs. Of course, they don't simply copy what's out there. Sure, some do this. But others adopt some things, chuck out some others. Still, there are limits imposed on their freedom by morality, customs. But above all, it's the limits imposed by the institutions they belong to that shape their emotions. I'll come back to this a little later. First, I want to get to my third point about the historical perspective on emotions. It concerns processes of learning and feedback. People make emotional styles their own through multi-dimensional learning processes involving imitation, initiation, and also reflection. It is cognitive learning just as much as it is performative and bodily learning. Like I said before, emotions are acted out by the body, go through the body, change the body. At the same time, the physical expression of an emotion affects how it is felt. In 1872, Charles Darwin observed that emotions can be both intensified and dampened depending on how they are expressed. Wilhelm Wundt, the father of experimental psychology in Leipzig, agreed with Darwin in 1877 when he wrote about professional weepers. There were no more professional weepers in Germany in those days, but he went as far as to Sicily in order to find them, women who are being kind of called upon to come to a house where somebody has passed away. And these professional weepers during or while they're weeping, their emotional expression evokes the emotion itself. So they start weeping, as Wundt observed, they start weeping, and by weeping, they feel sadness. If someone sinks their head enough, cries enough, they're not just expressing the feeling of sadness in a certain way, they evoke, through these bodily practices, they evoke or strengthen the feeling of sadness itself. German playwright Gotthold Ephraim Lessing was ahead of the two psychologists by 100 years. In the late 1760s, he made the same point about the connection between body and feeling, the same point in his influential treatise on how to act in theater. He advised actors to imitate emotional expressions which would cause them to feel the emotion. In a kind of feedback loop, the emotion would then affect the body in a way conducive to the part played. Lessing's advice in 1760s was not far off from the modern acting techniques developed by Konstantin Stanislavski and Lee Strasberg in New York. Laughter yoga, and that's Lee Strasberg here, is method acting. Laughter yoga, which is so popular today, I don't know if anybody ever experienced it. I did. I was very skeptical, absolutely skeptical, and I was completely convinced that it works. Then after that, it follows a similar principle. The principle runs, I'm not laughing because I'm happy because I'm laughing. Try it out, it works. Expression and feeling are thus closely intertwined, both influencing the other. But how to express a feeling is also a matter of cultural rules. If a culture makes an emotion taboo, people will have a hard time experiencing it because they will lack an expression for it and won't have many chances to see others express it. Anthropologists have observed such emotion taboos and their effects in all sorts of different cultures. And the opposite also holds true. When societies talk about certain emotions a lot, people feel these emotions with greater frequency. Let's take an example from today. Anything and everything is labeled an act of humiliation. And these are a few examples from the British scene here. You might already have forgotten about Theresa May, but she was the predecessor of Boris Johnson and tried to get the Brexit deal through Parliament and failed. We'll see how that continues now. And there is so much talk about she's humiliated and the humiliation of Theresa May. And we can find, probably in all our societies, you can find similar examples. So everything is labeled humiliation, with the consequence being a mass increase in people feeling humiliated. After all, emotions are means of communication. They send out signals. Look, I feel humiliated. Why don't you help me out? At the same time, every articulation of an emotion amplifies the emotion itself. People only understand that they feel humiliated when they say it. By this, they initiate interpersonal communication, which helps to build a narrative structure that strengthens the feeling. To return to an earlier point, not everything can be said and felt at any place at any time. Getting to the heart of what can be said and felt and why necessitates developing an understanding of institutions. And this is the definition that I use here. I mean the written and unwritten rules of a society that structure the behavior of its members. Institutions shape, stabilize, and give orientation to the actions of individuals and groups. And they do so in such a way that people interacting with one another can work with some shared expectations. And that's kind of the basic principle of communication. You have to have a shared understanding of what something means in order to communicate. But institutions don't just do that to people's behavior, to people's actions. They also do it to and with their emotions. When we speak of institutions, we think of things like families, religion, science, work. We might also think of lawyers' associations or pre-modern guilds. They don't just regulate who gets to belong on the basis of particular criteria or qualifications. They also enforce a moral regime. They determine what you're allowed to do and what you'd be better off just leaving alone. And they socialize their members into a certain emotional economy. They encourage some emotions while discouraging others. Unions, for example, trade unions, want their members to feel solidarity, while the chambers of commerce fosters competitiveness and an individualist kind of attitude. Some institutions tell their members who can love or marry, who and who not, in earlier times in a much more authoritarian fashion than today. They define what it means to be righteous and what it means to feel sympathy. The long and the short of it is that institutions exert a serious influence on how people feel and how they experience their feelings. For sure, institutions themselves don't have any feelings, because that's the prerogative of living beings. But they do develop a sort of canon, a set of highly held emotional values that they ingrain into their members. This is perhaps easiest to see with families. But it's also true of religion, which gives people more or less explicit directions on how one should feel and act towards God and one's fellow humans, with humility and mercy, with kindness and respect, with admiration and fear, all depending on the situation. Even the sciences have their emotion rules. René Descartes praised curiosity. Ekman seemed to have thought it not so important anymore. It doesn't figure as part of the 6 or 7 basic emotions. According to, and he must be mentioned in a lecture that is sponsored by the Goethe Institute, according to Johann Wolfgang Goethe, and I just love this quote, a thinking man's greatest happiness is to have fathomed which can be fathomed and to revere in silence what cannot be fathomed. And I just repeat it in German because the German is much more beautiful. Das schönste Glück des denkenden Menschen ist, das Erforschliche erforscht zu haben und das Unerforschliche ruhig zu verehren. Wow. Institutions, not just those mentioned before, but also schools, the welfare state, sports teams, etc. Institutions are characterized by their relative stability and continuity. They stick around for a long time, but they are anything but static. They change, and so do the emotional repertoires that they supply their members with. I already mentioned families. We might as well consider schools. When I went to school in the 60s, teachers hit and shouted at their pupils, getting all red in the face as they humiliated them in front of the whole class. They loved that. Kids still had to stand in the corner with their back turned to the class, and this is a famous sculpture by a famous West German artist, Martin Kippenberger, who is no longer around, unfortunately. Martin, into the corner, you should be ashamed of yourself. So that's the kind of usual experience of kids who kind of behave unruly and then are not driven out of class, but out of the classroom. But they have to stay in the classroom, stand in the corner with a back to the class. A wonderful situation to be in, I tell you. Maybe I don't know about Korean schools, but those were the days. And humiliation went on. Grades were read out loud in front of everybody, and shaming was an almost everyday event. Today, teachers pride themselves on their sensitivity towards shame and tend to treat pupils with respect and consideration. Exceptions confirm the rule as usual. Let's go back to my earlier argument that people learn how to feel and don't just have emotions as some sort of evolutionary biological fact. From this, it follows that institutions are primary sites of learning. They communicate knowledge about emotions and they train people to practice certain emotional behaviors. They establish rules about which emotions of which intensity should be felt in which situations and which should not. People, however, don't always follow these rules. My generation, in particular, made breaking the rules into a principle of liberation. Some individuals did it, others followed. At the end, institutions had changed, and new emotion rules applied. Opportunities for change can also arise when different systems of rules come into conflict. After all, modern society is comprised of numerous institutions, and not everybody belongs to every single one. Children learn about competing institutions early on in their lives. They've got their family over here, and the kindergarten, the school, the playground over there. They experience the friction between the emotion rules of these institutions, which prepares them for the grown-up world where the coexistence of many institutions is a given. Again, family, workplace, sports teams, church choirs, political party, etc., etc. The multitude of institutions cranks up the pressure on individuals to keep their divergent emotional scripts apart. Act differently at the office than you do at home. Differently in church than you do at the local party chapter meeting. But for all the strain, the social and emotional mobility demanded of modern humans also opens up possibilities for change. When the emotional practices of different institutions veer away from one another too much, it can stress out the people who belong to them, and the society that houses them can experience conflicts. The collisions, in turn, increase the need for reconciliation, now on an institutional and not just interpersonal level. And because all this might seem very abstract, I would like to give you an example, the military. West Germany brought back compulsory military service in 1956. East Germany then followed in 1962. They first had to build the wall, which came down tomorrow, exactly 30 years ago. Sure, soldiers were supposed to be citizens in uniforms and were no longer expected to hand in their civil rights at the barracks gate, unlike their predecessors. Nevertheless, military service was characterized by the same old traditional military culture, barking drill sergeants, authoritarian officers, and of course, everyday rituals of humiliation for the recruits. Civil society wasn't bothered much by this. In a survey conducted in 1956, 63% of women, and be aware of the gender difference here, 63% of women and 55% of men were of the opinion that today's youth needed the military because it would teach them some order and decency. Things changed in the 1960s, the decade when parents stopped allowing teachers to hit their kids, and more young men made use of their constitutional right to refuse conscription. In 1967, a general complained about troops' loss of masculinity and their basically civilian attitudes during their free time, meaning they didn't like to wear uniforms when they visited their parents. In the same year, the West German army prohibited shoulder-length or otherwise feminine hairstyles, as a quotation, among its ranks. And what they had in mind were the Beatles, very kind of, I would say from today's perspective, very neatly combed and shaved young men, but that was too feminine. The prohibition found little resonance, though, because it was out of step with the social development of the times. Thus, 4 years later, in 1971, then Defense Minister Helmut Schmidt, who later became a Social Democratic Chancellor, published the infamous Hairnet Decree. You see it here. It dictated that soldiers' hair and beards had to be well kempt, and that those with long hair had to wear a hairnet while on duty. This led the Bundeswehr to order 740,000 hairnets. Pretty wild. The military conformed to a youth trend. So an institution changed its emotional code, which until then was all about masculine rigidity, uniformity, conformity. It changed its code because other institutions put it under pressure, institutions that allowed young men to live out their desire to escape from gendered expectations, loosen up, and break the rules. To avoid losing these young men to civil service, the military catered to their needs, at least partially and for a brief minute. By 1972, the Hairnet Decree was taken back. One wonders what happened to all those 740,000 hairnets. Now, in the last 30 minutes, I've touched on 3 important points for the history of emotions. First, people learn emotions before they have emotions. They learn them before they have them. This is true for the so-called 6 or 7 basic emotions, and all the more so for more complex emotions like curiosity, shame, humility, and trust. Second, the process of learning these emotions is formed by culture and society. Institutions are the primary sites of learning. They develop emotional codes, and they socialize members with these codes. As a rule, codes are articulated in language. In turn, language exerts a decisive influence on what people feel. Language frames and language labels emotions, and in doing so, makes them both recognizable and fit for expression. Third, institutional codes and rules are not static, but change over time. This brings us to what interests historians most of all, change. In the final 15 minutes of my talk, I want to offer you a glimpse into the workshop of historians of emotions. Emotions are a historical object in 2 senses. Emotions themselves are historical because they change over time and space. And emotions impact the course of history. They have historical causality. Both perspectives inform the exhibition on the power of emotions that is shown just outside this hall. It's not only shown here, it can be seen in almost 3,000 locations around the world, and I'm very proud to show you this map. From Vancouver in Canada to Sydney in Australia, from Pretoria in South Africa to Helsinki in Finland, from other places as well, and also, of course, in most of the posters are actually hanging in German institutions, mostly in Germany proper. The exhibition's basic setup was given to us. That's my youngest daughter Bettina, and I. We were to make 20 panels, and this format was given to us because it had been done before for other topics. So the people who commissioned and I will talk about them in due course, the people who commissioned this exhibition knew that this would work. The format worked for other topics and had to work for this topic as well. I don't know. So we were to make 20 panels with 6 to 8 images each and a text of no more than 1,000 characters. The texts had their own requirements. They were supposed to be relevant for the present, always start with the present, addressing visitors in their present state of mind. They had to deal, second requirement, they had to deal with the Nazi period, and third, East Germany. Discussing both are the missions of the 2 public foundations that commissioned the exhibition. One is the Foundation for Remembering Responsibility and Future, which deals with the Nazi past, and the other is the Foundation for the Study of the Communist Dictatorship of East Germany. But the texts were also supposed to reflect on 8 decades of democracy in Germany, both in the Weimar Republic starting in 1919 and in the Federal Republic starting in 1949. All that in clear, comprehensible language, without jargon, and with a wealth of examples. Besides that, we were free to do as we pleased. We used, some irony in this sentence, we used this freedom to take a fresh look at the history of the 20th century, or more precisely of the period between 1919 and 2019. This century produced 5 Germanys, as the German-American historian Fritz Stern put it in his autobiography. One state supplanted the next, and with the different systems of government came different emotional regimes, styles, repertoires. But how were we supposed to boil all that down to 20 panels and altogether 20,000 characters? Everybody who has to write a seminar paper knows what 20,000 characters mean. Pretty short. At the very beginning, we made 2 key decisions, one on content, one on form. We decided to radically free ourselves from the initial content given to us by the 2 foundations, which of course had already drafted these 20 texts on their own before commissioning us. We wanted to radically free ourselves because the foundation's texts repeated a didactic reading of history that we did not subscribe to. That reading said, emotions are bad and dangerous. They have no place in politics. And when they weasel their way in, you've got to put a leash on them. For us, this message was too simple and one-sided. Instead, we set out to show that emotions are communicative resources that can have different functions and different effects. Of course, we were aware of the fact that dictators and dictatorships love to manipulate and instrumentalize emotions for their own political ends. But that's not the whole story. Democratic societies have emotions and practice emotional regimes just as much. Take the example of fear. In the text, we talk about how the runaway inflation of the 1920s and the fear that money might lose its value, how both remain stamped in the collective memory of the nation. Germany's economic policies have been all about avoiding inflation ever since, something which is very hard to understand for many American economists. Fear was also a feeling that followers of National Socialism and state socialism tried to incite in their enemies, and whom they regarded as their enemies. This fear blocked resistance. During the 1980s in the Federal Republic, fear took on a mobilizing force in the peace movement, the anti-nuclear power movement, and the environmental movement, and today's Fridays for Future might be added. Last but not least, in certain contexts, fear was overcome and transmuted into resistance, like in the Leipzig Monday demonstrations starting in September 1989. 1,000 characters was really quite some pressure, and 7 images can't possibly capture all the different functions of fear in all the situations in which people feel fear. The texts only touch on these functions, and the images illustrate them. 1,000 characters aren't enough to underscore the shifts that the emotion of fear has undergone over the last century. How fear feels depends on who or what one is afraid of. Fear of inflation is different, feels different than fear of state violence or fear of losing one's social status. It makes a difference if somebody feels fear alone or if they know that their feeling is being shared by others. I hope that we had more success relating these changes in our panel on love. It's not difficult to grasp that love between a man and a man, and a woman, feels differently when homosexuality is considered a sin or persecuted as a crime, and thus has to be lived in secret, as opposed to when it's legal and can be freely expressed in public. How women experience love and sexuality has a lot to do with whether they can rely on contraceptives. And as far as the social construction of emotion goes, I remember very well the feeling of liberation following the 1977 publication of the Haidt Report. Building on her own empirical research and that of predecessors like the Kinsey Report, the author, Shea Haidt, developed a conception of female sexuality more open to new experiences. It differed starkly from Freudian, male-centered theories and refused to describe female desires as the complement to male needs. The study enabled, it indeed encouraged many women to live a more self-assertive life and acknowledge their own feelings instead of deprecating them as deficient aberrations from the general/male norm. That too changed the feeling of love, just like reframing what it means to be a patriot changed the feeling of patriotism, love for one's country. In 1919, the love of one's home country was sacrosanct. Excessively revered during the First World War, it was mobilized anew in reaction to Germany's defeat and the Treaty of Versailles. National Socialism transformed it into a pledge of allegiance to the ideology of racial superiority, which sought to justify the enslavement and extermination of other races. The Federal Republic's renunciation of patriotism culminated in Gustav Heinemann's unforgettable response. So Gustav Heinemann became the first, or was supposed to become the first social democratic federal president in 1969. And before he was elected, he was asked by the magazine Der Spiegel whether he loved his state. And his response was very short, very angry, actually. He said, "What the heck are you talking about? I love my wife, and that's it." Can you imagine? Can you imagine what that meant? For Heinemann, love was a private emotion, and he said that as a social democrat. Social democrats, first social democratic federal president, as social democrats since the late 19th century had been accused of having no country, having no fatherland. They were unpatriotic, they were deemed to be unpatriotic because they were internationals. Now, these social democrats said, forget about talking about love for the state, I love my wife, and that's it, fine. So, but even as a private emotion that Heinemann thought love to be, it took many different shapes and sizes. Now, I said earlier that alongside our decision to not assess emotions in an all-around negative light, we also made a decision about the form that the exhibition would take. We wanted it to focus, we had 20 panels, so we wanted it to focus on 20 distinct emotions. Of course, many of these emotions appear in combination and can seamlessly flow from one to the other, like resentment and rage. Selecting 20 emotions required making compromises. I would have liked to have included feelings of humility or honor, but they had to make way to the feeling of belonging, which my daughter argued for. Her reasons were in keeping with the requirements that the exhibition speak to the present. She wanted to both critique the 2018 renaming of Germany's Interior Ministry, now called the Ministry of Interior, Building and Community, or Homeland, Heimat, and she wanted to draw attention to migrants' precarious, ambivalent feelings of belonging in Germany. 20 emotions. That's a lot more than Ekman's 6 or 7 basic emotions, but it hardly covers the wide spectrum of feelings. Our selection was also informed by the topics that we wanted to address, topics that we thought have particular bearing for 20th century German history. Education, for instance, is discussed in the panel on curiosity, or the development of the welfare state features on the panel on solidarity. In the German language exhibition, the last panel in our alphabet of emotions is Zuneigung. Ironically, the first in English, affection. It tries to capture, well, that's a very significant moment in the emotional history of post-war Europeanism. That's the kind of main theme of that panel, from the fraternal kiss shared by socialist leaders to the complicated relationship between Konrad Adenauer, the first West German chancellor, and Charles de Gaulle, French president in those days. The two couldn't have been more different, and the same goes for their life experiences. Nevertheless, both were Catholic, and they developed an affection for one another on the basis of shared religion. Both knelt in Reims Cathedral, giving the official friendship between Germany and France a personal touch and well-needed depth. And actually, there is a very nice story to this, this photograph from 1963. You see that Charles de Gaulle is leaning towards Konrad Adenauer and about to do what the French usually do in these circumstances, kiss. And Adenauer was kind of appalled. That was not a German custom in those days. And what he did is kind of, very, very, there was a hint of a kiss on his lips, but he tried to avoid it. But still, they were good friends, became good friends. Now, you've got to decide for yourself whether the emotions we picked and the constellations we placed them in really do say something new about German history over the last century. I'd be interested to know what you think. Speak to me or drop me a note, write me an email. I should, of course, make clear that I do not think that Germany has a monopoly on these emotions, even though the concept of German Angst is very popular in the Anglo-American world. Angst is not an especially German emotion, nor is it one that distinguishes Germany from other nations. On the other hand, some feelings are hard to translate, like Geborgenheit, which is in a pinch we rendered as a feeling of belonging. But that doesn't quite capture it. Heimat or homeland was hard to translate. Both are emotions or emotional concepts with historical baggage, which includes the loss of home during the expulsions of Germans after 1945, which left 14 million people leaving their home country, and the attempt to reclaim regional affinities beyond the grasp of the nation state. These difficulties in translation, however, help to further emphasize the fact that emotions are largely determined by culture and history. Just as well, they show that emotions influence the course of history. Expelled Germans' feelings of Heimat, of home, was highly politicized after 1945 and played a huge role in Ostpolitik during the 1960s and early 1970s. Politicization also took place during the Third Reich, during Nazism, that built their politics on the disgust that ethnic Germans allegedly felt towards Jews who were degraded as parasites. In 1978, a very conservative politician, Franz Josef Strauss, you see him here, from Bavaria, again tried to mobilize the feeling of disgust when he insulted leftist intellectuals as rats and flies. The fact that he failed and that even conservative newspapers criticized this dung heap language is, if you ask me, one of the positive accomplishments of the Federal Republic's culture of democratic emotions. Thank you very much.